starts with Pythagoras, who went to study with the Zoroastrians, who were the greatest Persian astronomers and mathematicians. He returned to Greece with much more advanced scientific knowledge than anybody had. So he ended up creating an academy, which was essentially a secret society, and that they isolated themselves. Uh, they didn't share any of their knowledge or information with anybody. It was all kept as part of the group. I think for the first year or so, if you wanted to try and join the academy, you were allowed to reside there, but you couldn't say anything for like a year. And they had two very important ceremonies, one at sunrise and one at sunset. And they performed dance and music and song and poetry, I think improvisationally during those ceremonies. Now, I can say what I think about this stuff. The fact is, nobody knows anything, and almost all the information put out about Pythagoras is probably a rabbit hole, you know. So, just like the central creation myth of the entire what became known as the Silk Road that connected China, India, and the rest of the world, the primary creation myth along that entire road for millennia involved a golden grail descending from heaven and being so hot nobody could touch it. But then there was one guy who could touch it, and so hey, let's make him the chief. So that mythology was really about is based on cannabis, because cannabis and milk is what they were drinking in that grail. The Zoroastrians really changed up the grail to make their Eucharist, which was a huge influence on Judaism and Christianity. But what you notice with Pythagoras, even though we can't trust anything, there's a few little hints that you can pick up on. It's just like there's a few little hints of cannabis in the Bible. The burning bush that Moses sees, clearly would be a cannabis reference. So they make great efforts to obscure this information. Manna, the food that keeps the tribe alive during times of starvation, that's clearly cannabis seed flour. I could go on. There's a lot of obvious cannabis references in the Bible, and you find them too in ancient history. They've been obscured, but the symbol used by the Pythagoreans was a tripod, which is the same symbol used by the oracle at Delphi. So, what is the tripod? Well, the tripod is the evolution of the brazier or burner. It's a little mini fireplace that was deployed by the Scythians and just about everybody, at one time. Before the arrival of bong, cannabis and milk, basically they were throwing cannabis colas and flowers on burning coals the tripod was there to contain the fire, and usually there'd be like a teepee, or they'd do it indoors, and they'd create a smoke-filled environment, and people could go into the smoke environment, stay there for 5 minutes, and then when they came out, they'd be fully intoxicated. This was starting to drop away when cannabis and milk mixture. People realized that was like it's a lot easier. It was more immediate. You couldn't eat the colas and get high. The cold braziers disappeared is because they're replaced by these what they call corded ware pottery, which is pottery that's been wrapped with hemp. The Pythagoreans are using the tripod, and they're really into the connections between math and music and marijuana. And I say that because there's no reason for them to be using the tripod unless they're using it for cannabis intoxication. Now, the same thing is true with the Oracle at Delphi, who actually sits on top of the tripod and then has, robes that completely conceal it around the sides so that actually I think what's going on there is what I call vaginal ingestion. They make up a lot of rabbit holes about how there's a crack in the ground somewhere and some gas is coming up and that's what's intoxicating the Oracle at Delphi. But if you look at the history of what's going on and the prominent role of cannabis and its connection to the tripod, then you have to assume if they're getting high, it's being done with what everybody gets high with today, practically the same thing. So, it just doesn't make sense to steer away from cannabis to explain these things. You should be steering towards it because it's obvious that the history of cannabis has been obscured. Socrates is another example of somebody who has links to cannabis. And the Aristophanes is really responsible for the assassination of Socrates in a way because he was the Neil Simon of ancient Greece, and he wrote a play called The Clouds, in which he parodied Socrates. And when people like analyze and talk about the clouds, they make it seem like it's water vapor clouds up in the sky. That's not really what they're talking about. They're talking about clouds of smoke. Basically, in the play, Socrates has an academy, like Pythagoras had an academy, and when you go inside, it's real smoky inside. So and they use the smoke in order to attain wisdom. So, but at the same time, the point Aristophanes is making is that these are all a bunch of stupid stoners, and they're all just so high they don't even know what they're doing. And that play was very successful in sort of demonizing Socrates and convincing the center of gravity in Athens into believing that Socrates was corrupting the youth. So when you look at the history of the ancient world, there's a black hole in a lot of it because of the fanatical attempt to keep cannabis out of the story. And the Pythagoreans created the template for all the secret societies that followed. And you notice they looked to the East for enlightenment because the Zoroastrians were considered the most advanced. And they also obscured a lot of what was going on with, big magic show around Eastern, ideas of spirituality and stuff. So there's a tremendous corruption that went on and misdirection away from the science that the Pythagoreans were pursuing, turning that into some kind of like hokey occult seance with phony baloney hoodwinks, which is essentially what the occult is. And it's not that much different, really, if you look at the other side, because the flip side, fundamentalist religion, that's just as hokey. And the thing about the age that we live in is that there's real hope that we're going to pierce through this millennia of misinformation, mind control, and we're going to get to the bottom of who's really running things and how the system really works. And it might take a while to get there, but I think I'm on the path. And I think you can see that by the energy that's raised to resist and suppress my information. So, this is Steve Hager, reporting from the Phoenix Nest on why everything you know is twisted.